Welcome to the Adult Education Hour at Westminster Presbyterian Church in Minneapolis for Sunday, November 29th. My name is Matt Skinner. I serve as the Scholar for Adult Education at Westminster, and today I am happy to be joined by friend of Westminster, the Reverend Dr. Paul Capetz. Paul is the senior pastor at Christ Church by the Sea in Newport Beach, California, which sounds lovely this time of year.
It is.
Yeah. And if people don't know, Paul, what makes you friend of Westminster is for many years you were professor of historical theology at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. And so taught frequently at Westminster. You're ordained in the Presbyterian Church USA, correct? And
a member of the Presbytery of the Twin Cities area.
Excellent, good, and a longtime member or attendee at what was then called Kwanzaa.
That's right.
Presbyterian Church, and is now Liberty in Northeast Minneapolis. So,
right. But I know Westminster very well.
You do, and we're glad to have you back. People are excited to know. We're excited to know that I'm talking to you.
I always loved being at Westminster. Yeah.
Good. Well, I'm going to hopefully let you do most of the talking, but we're going to do this as a conversation, and I want to jump in with the question of polarization in not just American culture, but in American Christianity, which I think has probably always been there in some way, but a lot of us, I think, are noticing that more and more, and we can talk about how that looks, you know, politically when we see the statistics of who voted for what presidential candidate, and what did white evangelicals do, and what did Roman Catholics do, and what did mainline Protestants do, and what did African-American Christians vote for. We can talk about, you know, the way people think about systemic racism and whether that really hinders equity among people of color, and sometimes those things break down along denominational lines. So, I mean, we can talk about politics, and we can talk about, you know, society and people's ethics or morals, but I guess I'm interested in the question of whether there's something theological behind some of those divides. Like when you look at, you know, the state of the nation, or the state of, I guess, especially Protestantism in the nation, and see not just the liturgical differences, but when you see those differences really in how we're engaging in the public square, and how that matters for the causes we support or the policies we support or oppose. Is there something theological behind that? Are we somehow wired theologically to support certain things, or is that just about the politics in this country co-opting religion for its own ends? Does that make sense? I mean, where are some of the theological lines of difference as you see them?
Well, I think there has been a fault line in American Protestantism since approximately the late 19th century, the late 1800s, what has been called the fundamentalist modernist divide. And that we're seeing a replay of that in our time. We've been seeing a rise of a very well politically organized religious right in the last 40 years, since about the time of Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority. And it's been engaged in a relentless attack on the mainline Protestant churches for their supposed liberalism and forsaking of the traditional biblical faith. And their attack has always been based on a different understanding of the Bible that goes back to a rejection of modern historical critical ways of understanding the Bible that came to full fruition in the 19th century, but were associated with the acceptance of Darwinism in modern science. And so fundamentalism grew out of a rejection of a new worldview that was being taught by natural science and historical study of human culture and religion, including the Bible. And so fundamentalism reacted to this development by completely rejecting it, whereas the mainstream Protestant churches, such as the Presbyterian Church or the Methodist Church, increasingly opened itself to these modern developments and made an accommodation with them. And the difference between the worldviews in these two branches of Protestantism have led to a polarization on certain moral questions. In our time, specifically, the questions concern homosexuality and abortion, though there may be related questions such as a defense of unbridled capitalism on the part of a right-wing Protestantism and an openness towards certain influences from socialism on the part of mainstream Protestantism that would like to see unbridled capitalism modified by a greater concern for the poor and the needy. So we're in a time where this divide has become extremely vivid, but it's not brand new. We've been living with it for well over a century. And in some ways, it's a uniquely American phenomenon. It may have been exported to other countries, but the kind of divisions, I think, now I'm not an expert on this question, this is a guess, but German Protestantism, for instance, to my knowledge, has not been characterized by the same kind of division in the modern period over this set of issues as has American Protestantism. So that's why I say it seems to me that if it's not exclusively American, it seems like it's an Anglo-Saxon phenomenon, a phenomenon of English-speaking Protestantism. Do you agree with that or not? I don't know. You may know more about this than I do.
I don't think I know more about it, but I agree that that sounds correct. That what we call evangelicalism today is an outgrowth of the fundamentalist movement, or which was, like you said, roughly a little over 100 years ago. That was largely American, largely British, I think, as well, or at least English, and has been exported. But I don't know of similar kinds of movements in some of those other Western European nations, Protestant nations.
I don't either.
At least not the same way. And I don't know why that is. And I'm not sure I've ever seen a study on that. Because if it is, like you said, a kind of distinctively Anglo-Saxon kind of development, then I guess my next question is, well, why is that? And that's where we probably start speculating, isn't it?
Well, I've had two thoughts recently about that. One is that I think there is a very powerful strain of anti-intellectualism in American culture that goes back a long way. And I'm thinking of the famous book by Richard Hofstadter, Anti-Intellectualism in American, is it American Culture, American Life, or something like that. So I see the anti-intellectualism evident in American popular religion. And I think that American popular religion feeds on that anti-intellectualism. And so the kind of rejection of modern science and modern historical critical ways of studying the Bible are certainly an expression of anti-intellectualism. The other thing I would say is that it's possible that the forms of Protestantism that were most influential in America how can I put this? The forms of Protestantism that were influential in America may themselves be part of the problem. So I was recently reminded of a piece of writing that Dietrich Bonhoeffer did after his first trip to America in the early 1930s, and it was called Protestantism Without Reformation, which was how he characterized the religious substance of American Protestant denominations. Because as a German Lutheran who came to America and got to know the religious scene in American churches, he felt that he was experiencing something that was very foreign to him as a German Lutheran. And that's why he described our type of Protestantism as a Protestantism that's never been through a Reformation like Luther's. Now, when I went to Germany after I graduated from college and studied there for a year, I think I can honestly say that I encountered a form of Protestantism that was extremely different and superior to anything I had ever experienced in America. That is to say, there is something in the continental variety of Protestantism that goes back to the 16th century roots, as distinct from the 17th century English Puritanism from which most of our American denominations hail, that has a critical and a self-critical impetus in it that I think we could benefit from so much. So again, these are just two broad ideas. One is that we've got a very anti-intellectual culture when it comes to thinking about ideas about, I mean, not when it comes to science and technology, but when it comes to religion and ethics and politics, anything that has to do with the distinctively human. America is very anti-intellectual.
Right.
And when it comes to our Protestantism, we are far more shaped by traditions that emerged in England than in Germany and Switzerland. And I think that it would behoove us to learn a lot more from continental Protestantism than we have hitherto done. So I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but these are the two ideas I'm currently working with as I try to. I felt I guess you could say that I've always lamented that I never had the opportunity to go back and live in Germany again. I mean, I've spent time there again, but I had hoped that I could, have many more years. I was never able to get the funding for that. I felt more at home there than I do in America for those reasons.
I imagine that some evangelicals listening might say, well, look at the churches in Germany. They're all empty every Sunday. I mean, you can hear the pushback in some settings about something like that. Not to say you're wrong.
I mean, then we could explore with Dietrich Bonhoeffer what secularization is all about. I mean, the fact that churches are empty or full is neither a success, neither a sign of failure nor success. I mean, we've got mega churches here that have thousands of people here, but I wouldn't say they are faithful to the gospel. They may be successful in capitalistic terms,
right?
But so I mean, I don't take that observation that has no particular theological significance seriously.
Sure. I think this is helpful for kind of laying the landscape for why a lot of us encounter these differences. And certainly, I know conservative evangelicals, I know both of those words cry out for definition, but let's just give me a pass on that for a minute. I know conservative evangelicals who believe in climate change and that it's human caused, who believe in evolution. So it's and aren't anti-intellectual. So I mean, it's possible to dwell in that world. But say a little more about kind of how that fundamentalist modernist split like plays itself out. I mean, you mentioned the Bible. That's one aspect, right? Do we open the Bible up to different kinds of inquiry, and how do we read the Bible? Are there other ways in which that fundamentalist modernist split or debate like plays itself out every Sunday morning in ways we might not even notice?
Well, I don't think.
Or is it only about the Bible, I guess, is part
Well,
of
you know, I think it is and it isn't about the Bible. One of the things that I have been struck by among American Protestants, you know, when they talk about the Reformation heritage, for instance, 80% of them will talk about Scripture alone as the issue for which the Bible was fought. Only 20% of them will talk about justification by faith alone as the issue for which the Reformation was fought. Now that says something very striking to me about, you know, that's the distinction between what scholars call the formal principle of the Reformation versus the material principle of the Reformation. That's a complete reversal of Luther's own priorities. And so I mean, even in, you know, I studied at Yale Divinity School, which I came to regret later on, because I think it's a symptom of this very problem. So even at the higher echelons of academic theology, where people do pay lip service to Darwin, and, you know, they nonetheless, when push comes to shove, they still treat the Bible with this kind of knee-jerk, it's a sacred cow. You know, I mean, the issues they've conceded the issues of science and history and women, right? But I mean,
Can you explain that, to concede science, women, and history?
Well, I mean, you know, it's on a, I mean, you know, some of these battles have already been lost, right? Ipso facto. You know, I mean, when in my first year at Yale Divinity School, I remember hearing Brevard Childs, who was a big Old Testament scholar there, give a lecture on homosexuality. It was a public lecture because this issue had just kind of begun to emerge as a significant challenge. And I had been told by one of Child's graduate students that Childs didn't believe in any of the miracles in the Bible. I mean, he had spent 4 years in Germany and Switzerland getting his PhD under all those hard-nosed Old Testament scholars, right? You know, so he knew that Moses hadn't written the Pentateuch, or you know, but you know, I had been told that he didn't believe any of the miracle. So in other words, he wasn't a supernaturalist in any sense of the word. Neither was I. but you know, the whole you could summarize Child's entire lecture by saying that homosexuality is wrong and the church can't accept it because that's what the Bible says. And I can remember thinking to myself, is this what I came to a university, an Ivy League divinity school to hear? I could have heard this at an evangelical Bible college in Tennessee. You see what I mean? This was the level of sophistication about the ethical argument. In other words, Child wasn't fighting about whether women could be ordained anymore, right? Or whether slaves should stay in their place, you know. But I mean, it was the same logical type of argument, even though he knew everything there is to know about modern science and the historical study of the Bible and accepted them fully. And yet, you know, for my 4 years at Yale, not only by Childs, but by so many other professors, every time there was a major argument about something, it always boiled down in the final analysis to biblical authority. So I don't know what you refer to that as. I mean, it just left me scratching my head thinking, these people say, they aren't really fundamentalists, but then they act like fundamentalists when push comes to shove. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do.
I felt like I was the only crazy person in the room. No, I'm serious. I mean, I thought to myself, what on earth is going on here? When you go listen to these lectures and you're told Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, Moses didn't part the Red Sea, etc. Jesus didn't utter the words attributed to him in the Gospel of John, right? All of the traditional trappings that you associate with a conservative fundamentalist view of the Bible are not true. But then when there's a controversial issue in the church, it doesn't even have to be, let's take inclusive language. The same thing. God has revealed that his name is Father, Son, and Spirit in the Bible. I just can't wrap my mind. I don't get how it follows. If in the classroom you treat the Bible as an ancient document of ancient Near Eastern and Hellenistic religion, but then when it comes to these, normative questions, you all of a sudden switch gears and your answers are no different in principle from what Jerry Falwell would have said at his university.
Yeah.
What's the point of doing all this biblical study?
Yeah.
Don't you have any more sophistication you see what I mean? And so that's what, I was too naive in my 20s to have anything. I couldn't fight against it because I didn't have any, I had to wait until I went to the University of Chicago to learn,
Sure.
better arguments. But, and I say this because, I think that this is so deep in American culture. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the reasons why more liberal or mainstream Christianity is withering away is because people who are rejecting that kind of argumentation altogether in the name of enlightenment and all modern values are just rejecting Christianity altogether.
Because they don't see the church as having a credible alternative.
And that's because most of it doesn't.
Right. Well, this is maybe 5 years old now, but a Pew study that was interviewing millennials about how they perceive Christianity. And
how do they?
Well, I don't remember the exact results, but I do remember that they see it as homophobic and as anti-science and just generally intolerant, and those are pretty much.
I can't tell you how many times I have been introduced to people as a minister or a professor of theology, and people ask me questions like, does that mean you don't believe in evolution? Or does that mean you believe Jews are going to hell? Mm-hmm. Or, that's the public perception of Christianity in our culture.
Right.
And that shows you who's got the upper hand in terms of determining how Christianity is thought of, whether you accept Christianity or you reject it.
Right. And the fault for that probably lies in history, lies in Christian leadership, lies in the way in which the media loves to portray Christians and the church. There's a lot going on there, but I'm taken by what you say about how we haven't offered a credible or an enticing alternative. And we is, again, a really broad category there. That's a real concern. What are the ways to do that? Can that be done? Or is the kind of Christianity we're talking about, which I think is the kind of Christianity that Westminster tries or, aspires to to practice, and I think you do too, knowing you, that is that just kind of fated to be a kind of minoritized way of being Christian in the United States?
Well, that's my fear. That's my fear.
It will always be outnumbered, so to speak, or always be the
Well, I think part of the problem is that even people on our side of the aisle partake of the anti-intellectualism of American culture.
well,
And,
you
and
perhaps just cited that with the lecture at Yale you talked about, right? That there's a kind of
well, I mean, I would say that Brevard Childs represent, I mean, the heart of Brevard Childs was on the right wing of culture, obviously. No matter how high he was in the academic echelon, and no matter how many concessions he had made to highbrow intellectual culture with respect to science and history and whatnot, Childs was still attempting to defend a 17th century understanding of biblical authority. But
some norms he just wouldn't want to let go of, right? Perhaps, right? Some ethical norms that he didn't want to interrogate, maybe.
Oh, of course not.
Yeah.
Of course not.
But
I mean, but even people who are liberal, in my experience, religiously liberal, partake of a great deal of anti-intellectualism because they believe that religion is a matter of feelings and not of convictions that can be intellectually articulated and defended rationally. And that's where I think the fatal flaw lies on the liberal or progressive wing of American Protestantism. It used to be the case that people on our side of the aisle in American Protestantism were the carriers of a rigorously intellectual tradition. I don't know when that dissipated, but I think it's been within my adult lifetime. I've heard John Cobb, who is a liberal Methodist theologian, note that there has been a real sea change in his lifetime between the time when liberal ministers used to think that academic theology was really important to their sense of ministry, and the time we now find ourselves in, where it's something that it's like a hobby of those who happen to be interested in that sort of thing pursue, but it has no real bearing on, and 75% of the liberal students that I tried to teach at the various seminaries I worked at would have that attitude. There's nothing necessary about doing the hard work of theology. So I think that the anti-intellectualism of American culture is the chief obstacle to being able to formulate an intellectually persuasive alternative to what the right is doing. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I've just felt like I was, for most of the, for most of the times that I was teaching in seminaries, I felt that I was talking to myself and wondering what these people were going to go out and start preaching in their pulpits, because there was just nothing much in their heads. And when I've listened to so many liberal Protestant ministers, I see the same vacuousness in their sermons. Before I had this position here in Newport Beach, I listened to a Methodist minister for 2 years in San Diego who was a graduate of Claremont. Claremont used to be a very distinguished seminary, I think, if you graduated from Claremont in the 60s and 70s, you were a really sharp minister. But I listened to her sermons for 2 years, and I couldn't figure out what her interpretation of the gospel was. And I heard there were a couple of other people in the congregation who made similar comments to me, that her sermons were just pablum, and I mean, I just don't think this is that exceptional. It's rare that I hear a really good sermon.
What does this mean then for, I mean, for the people watching this?
By the way, you hear them all the time at Westminster. I mean, you've got really great ministers at Westminster. So you guys got the cream of the crop. But
We will not.
what happens at Westminster is not typical of what's going on in every Presbyterian or Methodist church throughout the United States. Okay.
We won't edit this part out. That's good.
No, but I really mean that. I mean, I know I've seen the quality, but that's what I'm saying.
So in many ways, what we're talking about now is around leadership, and not just the question of like who leads churches, but also what's demanded of them, the ways in which congregations themselves find themselves more kind of drawn into a market culture where there's so much that they have to do, or so much that the minister has to do. What does this mean for people watching this? For your accusation of anti-intellectualism, does that mean, to really be Christian these days, you've got to be, you've got to start building a theological library, or what does that mean? What advice would you give?
I don't know what it means for, people who aren't, I mean, because I'm a leader of a church and I've been teaching other people who are, I'm particularly concerned with the state of the leadership of the church. That's been my professional vocation. I'm not saying that the average person in the pew needs to start building a theological library or something like that. But I mean, I can tell you that from other things that I hear people in the pews saying, they know when they've got a good leader and when they don't. They know when they've got a good preacher and when they don't. So it's not like they're indifferent to whether their leaders have quality. But I think your previous comment just a minute ago says a lot. We are being increasingly driven by market dynamics, and that's shaping our perceptions of what a seminary education is supposed to look like. And so for example, and I'll give you an example. So, before the pandemic struck, a well-meaning person made the suggestion that, if we were to, this is a person who attends a mega church that has like this great rock band, and if you've ever been to one of these churches or watched, their videos, I mean, it's like going to a concert at the Target Center, right? Just imagine your favorite star. I mean, these are entertainment things, right? But she was basically saying, look, if you only got the kind of musical talent that these mega churches have, a band and all, you'd start to reel them in like fish. And she may be right from a market perspective, but I was thinking at the back of my mind, well, what about the quality of a sermon? I mean, a really good, thoughtful sermon. You see, I mean, that's not a market consideration.
Right.
But I mean, she's probably right about what sells. But you see, when I go to these mega churches or listen to them, they have fantastic entertainment. I mean, I do wish we had that kind of stuff. But then when you listen to what's being said, I cringe.
Right. Well, that ties into, maybe let me pause here briefly and just say too that you'll be with us again next Sunday, which is December 6th. And so if people want to feed questions or comments to me,
Sure,
record it in advance, but people can email me at the church's and my email address at the church, and I'll be happy to try to bring those questions to you for our second time together.
And people are free to disagree with me. I mean, I don't, my opinions are just mine.
We'll take comments too. Yeah, but if people can email me those by the end of the day on Monday the 30th, that would be helpful. So early, you just said something, then earlier you said that a mega church might be packing it in, but you don't think they're necessarily being faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ. So what does that mean again for us when we talk about things like Christian unity? We talk about things like participation, when we say things like, well, the Holy Spirit leads people in different ways. And I mean, it's the Sunday after Thanksgiving when people are watching this. Some people have, well, we're not having big family gatherings. Maybe some people were on Zoom with their relatives and
Well, I
and
mean,
sometimes wonder if they worship the same God as their relatives, even though they both.
I don't really think much of Christian unity anymore. I mean, I did grow up in a church that taught me to appreciate ecumenism. So I'm not insisting that my denomination is the only true church or something like that. But we all have to make theological judgments about what authentic faith is. And I have to, a lot of people are offended when I make these judgments, as though, you know, we're somehow wrong to make these judgments, but I don't see how any honest person can avoid them. I mean, I see a lot of faithlessness in the name of Christianity. And so I think that I have to denounce that where I see it, even if it means no Christian unity. I mean, there is such a thing as a false Christian unity, right? Wouldn't you agree?
I would agree. Or what passes as Christian unity is sometimes just, I won't criticize you if you don't criticize me, or I'll grant you legitimate.
Well, sure, yeah, right. No, and I've never been interested in that kind of thing. I mean, I'd rather have an honest enemy than a false friend.
What's the faithlessness that you see that becomes that the
Well,
marker of the
you
aisle
know,
for you?
When I first came to Newport Beach here, one of the parishioners wanted me to see this big mega church in our area, and so she took me and we visited it, and it's huge. I mean, it makes Westminster look like a small church, and they have a coffee shop and a bookstore, and it didn't even look like a church to me, really. It just looked so different. And they have a store, a thrift store, and but I looked at the books they were selling in the bookstore, and I just, you know, felt sick to my stomach. Things like biblical womanhood, you know, about keeping women in their place, and they had books about how we've been lied to about what the American Constitution teaches about the relationship between church and state, because the so-called truth is that this nation was founded to be an explicitly Christian nation. And so I contacted the pastor of the church after visiting the plant and the physical plant, and I just asked him some specific questions about, you know, would they ever hire a woman to be a pastor there? Well, no, they would never do that. And could a gay couple ever get married there? Well, no, of course not. You know, and do they really not believe in the separation of church and state? Well, no, because that's not what the Constitution. I mean, you know, it just down the line. I mean, it's just, I mean, they are successful. I mean, they've got probably 10,000 people going there every Sunday. So, I mean, but I mean, I think those people are being sold a bill of goods that, I mean, we can't compete with them, but I have no doubt that the sermons that I'm preaching every Sunday are far better and more faithful. And this is always a judgment call. So, I mean, you know, there's no objectivity in the strict sense here, but this is the problem I'm trying to point out, right? This is what I'm trying to say, is that what I consider to be the authentic Protestant tradition these days doesn't have much of a chance of getting a hearing.
Mm-hmm.
The vast majority of people in that church, I'm sure, support right-wing politics. I'm sure the vast majority of people in that church are white. So I mean, I think there is something going on there that is very problematic. And this is not an isolate. This is probably what's going on in all the mega churches. You know, do you disagree? I mean, again, I'm not an expert on it, so you know, this is impressionistic on my part. You know.
So what's a theological interpretation of that, or how should we interpret what's going on? Is it,
well, have you ever worked through and studied carefully H. Richard Niebuhr's book Christ and Culture?
Once upon a time?
Well, I
Don't
mean,
ask me questions.
well, I mean, it's really one of those books that all of us should know very well, because Niebuhr shows that there are basically 5 different ways of relating the gospel to our surrounding culture, whatever that culture happens to be. And that this typology he develops is based upon fundamentally different understandings of key theological categories such as God, world, sin, grace, church, etc. And so that if you were to do a theological analysis of what's going on in a mega church, there is no doubt that what you would find if you use Niebuhr's template is that this is all an illustration of what Niebuhr calls the Christ of culture model, where there is an identification going on between a particular understanding of American culture and a particular understanding of Christianity, so that there's a complete symbiosis between them and no possible tension between them, with the result that if one is a true Christian, one is this particular kind of American. If one is a true American, one is this particular kind of a Christian. And so you've so defined the terms that there's no possibility whatsoever of self-transcendence in a critical vein. But you have to have the kind of conceptual categories in your mind, such as provided by Niebuhr, to be able to perform that kind of analysis, which depends upon a lot of depth of learning and reflection. Without that, you're just dumbfounded by it. You're rolled over by it like a bulldozer. You see?
Or we experience those tensions, right? We wonder why we don't.
We experience them, but we may not be able to have any insight that illumines what we're feeling.
To analyze it. Right.
Something may feel wrong to me, but if I don't have the conceptual categories to name what's going on and point it out to myself and to others, it remains mute.
In that kind of a landscape, is there a danger for one kind of church to identify itself over against the other? Isn't
that what the mega churches are doing? In fact, they are sectarian in their understanding, right? They see themselves as the true church over against all of us faithless churches.
I have heard some of that. It's different if they're the biggest one in the room, perhaps, but it might be different if one of the smaller people in the room does that. I don't know, but I've known congregations, I've known in schools and other institutions that have had such a hard time articulating their own identity or what we are for. They spend most of their time saying, you know, those people over there, we're not them.
Oh yeah, well that was like a lot of the schools I taught at.
Okay.
Right. But that's because they didn't have a theological foundation on which to stand.
Mhm. So
These
I
are
just,
people who wouldn't know anything about Christ and culture by age or people.
yeah, but I mean, I guess I worry about communities where that could just feed resentment, or that could feed a kind of persecution complex, or that could feed a sense of, well, the reason we know we're right is because we're unpopular. I mean, you see how that there needs to be some kind of a sense of clarity of not just what are we for, not just around issues, but what kind of a God do we believe in? I mean, you mentioned when you were talking about Niebuhr that one of the questions this comes back to is God. Who is the God you proclaim, right? What do you understand God to be like? Seems such a key question for everybody to
Of course it
be
is. Of
able to
course it
ask,
is.
right?
Of course it is.
Um,
I mean, in some senses, I don't think we Christians are all worshiping the same God. I mean, and that's why I think this idea of Christian unity can be easily a sham. So that if you put some of these Christians in a room together and begin to pull at the theological assumptions undergirding their different practices as Christians, I think you're going to find very different theologies at work. But if there are such radically different understandings of what it means to be a Christian, then how can there be Christian unity? Right?
yeah, and you aren't obviously asking to start, the old religious wars in Western Europe.
Well, no, I
No,
don't believe it. I don't, but I don't believe in a religiously undergirded society. I mean, I'm a defender of the separation of church and state.
right.
So one of the great threats that I see coming from the religious right is the end of such a society. I'm a defender of a secular society. If by secular you mean in principle a society that does not have an official religion. Now, whether that doesn't mean that people don't go to church like they do, like in Germany or something, or Scandinavia, but I mean, the fact that we do not have an official religion makes all the difference in the world. The fact that people have the freedom to choose any religion or no religion makes all the difference in the world. But there is a very powerful movement among this right-wing Christianity that we've been talking about that does not affirm this ideal. My debates would be debates, not persecutions, because I don't believe that we should wield political power against one another on behalf of our religious and theological differences. We have to appeal to people's hearts and minds, which is to say, through the use of our reason and our persuasive capacities, our words and our ideas, which is why I think the intellectual components of theological education and pastoral ministry are so important. We have to convince people that truth is on our side. But I of course I don't believe in holy war or persecution, or I'm completely opposed to that. But I mean, I do see a big threat coming from the religious right in this country. You see, that's one of the impetuses behind the homeschooling movement in this country. The people who homeschool their children do so in large part not only so that their children won't learn about modern science as taught in our public schools, because it supposedly conflicts with what the Bible teaches, but so that they won't learn what they're going to learn in civics classes in American public schools about the separation of church and state. You see, that is a very serious, just imagine what would happen to this country if there were a political takeover by the religious right and they undid the religious freedom that has characterized this nation from its inception. You might think I'm hysterical by saying this, but this is a very real threat.
Oh, I think it's a real threat, especially when you read what some of those folks are saying. So
Well, that's what that's why, I mean, I don't know what kind of unity you want us to have here.
I'm going to let you clarify one thing. I think you meant to say not all homeschoolers, but some homeschooling movements that come out of that.
Well, I mean, I don't know what reasons. I mean, the major ideological reasons for homeschooling have to do with the rejection of modern science and the rejection of American civics.
All right, we might get an email on that one, but
that's fine. But I mean, as a movement, that's what's behind this.
I think we have time for one more question for this, our first session, and that's so for you as a pastor of a congregation, what does this look like for you when you, pre-COVID and hopefully post-COVID, when you meet somebody who's visiting your church for a first time and wants to chat with you, they want to chat with you about, what's this church like? What kinds of things do you say? What's your 2-minute speech about what your congregation does and is like, and why people should be interested in being a part of it?
Well, my first impression and my most enduring impression of my particular congregation is that it's a very caring, loving group of people. And that's what people tend to say about the church when they come to it or have been a part of it for many years. So I think that my congregation exemplifies a great deal of the ideal of what it means to be a Christian congregation. Yeah, that's certainly the spirit that undergirds our mission. Yeah. There's a lot of lonely people in the world who I think would give their right arm to be a member of a congregation like ours.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I'm grateful for the work that you're doing there. I want to remind folks to send me an email with questions, comments, rebuttals, complaints, praise, whatever for Paul. And next week we'll meet again and take the conversation a couple steps further. But thanks for your time.
Good to be with you, Matt. Take good care. Happy Thanksgiving to you.
Absolutely. Same
and
to
everyone else. Good to be with you. Happy Thanksgiving.